When it was released back in 2018, the Sony A7 III was the best-selling camera of the year. But does it still hold up to the standards of 2025? Well, having owned this camera for a number of years and having taken over 100,000 photos, today I'm going to show you why I think that the Sony A7 III is the best budget full-frame camera for wildlife photography in 2025. And the first thing I want to talk about is something that's synonymous with all full-frame cameras, and that's the beautiful sensor that's found inside. This sensor is 24 megapixels, which for me provides ample resolution for where I'm putting most of my photos, which is Instagram. Now, by today's standards, when you compare them against the 50 megapixel A1 or the 61 megapixel A7 III series, this can seem quite low. However, 9 times out of 10 my photographs are going on Instagram, and as a platform, Instagram is going to compress your photographs anyway. And the big difference that you're going to see between the higher resolution cameras like the A1 or the A7 III series is the amount of cropping that you're able to do and still come away with a sharp shot. But when I do want to print my photographs out big, then this camera is more than capable of doing so. In fact, the photographs that you can see behind me, these are all A3 size, and I took each one of these with the A7 III. Now, the other thing about full-frame cameras in general is their wonderful noise performance. If you've been using an APS-C camera for any length of time, you'll notice that when you start to push your ISO up to about 3000 or 4000, you definitely introduce a lot more grain. Whereas with the Sony A7 III and most full-frame cameras, I'm able to push my ISO up way higher, up to about 12,800. The big benefit to this, especially when it comes to wildlife photography, is when we're going down into those low light situations, such as shooting in woods, or perhaps shooting in the end of the evening, we're able to bump our ISO up higher without having to sacrifice any of our shutter speed. And as such, it's far easier to come away with a sharp shot. And whilst we're on the subject of performance, let's talk about how the A7 III behaves in the field. Now, one of the most important factors when you are buying your first camera, especially for wildlife photography, is the frame rate. The Sony A7 III is capable of shooting at 10 frames per second, which when you compare it to some of the more modern cameras, definitely seems far slower. I think the Canon R6 can shoot at about 20 frames per second. This means that these cameras are more likely to capture each one of the moments, so you've got far more options to pick from. However, for most cases, the Sony A7 III has been pretty good to me. The main cases where I wish I had a higher frame rate is for very fast moving subjects, such as when I went to go shoot diving osprey, because the actual action of the dive is incredibly quick, so you're going to have only a few different shots to choose from. And the number of shots that you're going to come away with is very much going to be influenced by the tracking. And there's 2 different factors which are going to control how well you're able to track your subject. The first of which, of course, is the autofocus of the camera. For me, I found that in most cases the Sony A7 III is pretty good, but when you're tracking faster moving subjects, especially one coming at the camera, it can often lose focus, depending on the sort of lenses that you're using. And I've often found that it tracks slightly less well on third-party lenses. So if we go back to our osprey example, when it dives into the water and then the camera loses focus because it can no longer predict where our subject is going to appear, it might focus on the background, so you might end up losing the first couple of shots when the osprey first comes out of the water and flies away. And the other factor to talk about with tracking is your general skill. Now, obviously you can develop your skill over time, but it's going to be helped a lot by the camera. You see, when you're shooting at 10 frames per second on the Sony A7 III, it will no longer show you live view. This can make it very hard for you to track your subject. So in order to enable live view, you actually have to stop down to 8 frames per second. So this means that you'll come away with slightly fewer shots, but it's more likely that each of your shots is going to be well framed. And the final thing that I want to talk about when it comes to performance is the inbuilt image stabilization. Sony states that this camera has a stabilization of about 5 stops, but I've got quite shaky hands and I've really pushed this to the limit, and generally I find that I can shoot about 2 stops under what I would predict without in-body stabilization. But you might get better results if you've got steadier hands than me. Now, if you're thinking about buying a budget camera, it's highly likely that this is probably going to be your first significant investment into the world of photography. As such, what we want to do is to make sure that we're investing into a system that we can grow with over time. And the Sony E-mount is absolutely fantastic for this. This is because there's such a fantastic wide range of lenses that you have available to you, not only from Sony, but also from third-party manufacturers as well. This wide range of lenses is going to give you versatility to grow into, because you can start off on cheaper lenses, maybe from third parties, for example, the Tamron 150 to 500, or maybe even the Sigma 150 to 600, 600, which is what I personally use, and I think it's fantastic. And then over time, if you want to upgrade to some of the features that you find specifically on the Sony lenses, then you're more than welcome to do that, because each one of these lenses is going to work with this camera. In terms of the current state of the market, for beginners in particular, I think that Sony really is positioned so well. Nikon is starting to bring in some cheaper lenses and open up its mount to third parties, but we haven't seen any third-party wildlife lenses yet. So if you wanted to photograph on the Nikon system, then you're probably going to be spending a lot more money initially. And Canon is just the same case as well, and it's only just opened up its mount to third-party manufacturers. As such, I don't think we're going to be seeing wildlife lenses from third-party manufacturers or any cheaper options for Nikon or Canon anytime soon. So for me, Sony is definitely the way to go, especially if you're a beginner wildlife photographer. Now, I would always say invest in your lenses initially, because you're going to see a far greater increase in the quality of your images and the variety that you're able to achieve through investing in lenses versus investing into the body. But the great thing with the E-mount is when you do want to upgrade, then Sony has various different options available. There's already the Sony A7 IV, which is slightly more expensive than the Sony A7 III, and we're going to talk about value in just a moment. Or once you start to develop your skills and you realize that you really want the absolute sharpest photo that's possible, maybe you could look at the Sony A7 R series. My point here is that there's loads of different options available for photography, and your lenses that you would have invested in whilst you have your Sony A7 III will work absolutely perfectly with each one of these bodies. Okay, so I said I'd talk a little bit about the value. And I think the real value in the Sony A7 III is not in buying it new, because it's about £1,200, but because this camera has been out since 2018, there are so many on the used market which are like new that you can buy from Wex or MPB, where they have fantastic warranties, and you can get them for around £1,000. And if you're to compare this to the new body, which is the Sony A7 IV, which does have better autofocus and higher resolution sensor, but you're paying more than double the price. And for me personally, I'd rather spend that extra money on getting a better lens, because as we discussed earlier, the lens is really where you're going to get the most amount of value. And if you do end up looking for a used Sony A7 III, make sure that you look at the shutter count. Both of my Sony A7 IIIs are at a shutter count of about 60,000, and so far I haven't had an issue, but people have reported across the internet of shutters failing at around 100,000. So in the interest of fairness, what reasons do I think that you shouldn't buy the A7 III? Well, for me, it depends on the amount of video that you're going to shoot. For the time that this camera was released, this camera had very good video specs, giving you 4K 25 and 100 frames per second at 1080. For most people, this is going to be more than enough. All videos that you see on Instagram are 1080, and most videos that you'll see on YouTube end up being 1080 as well. In fact, I'm quite interested to know how many people do watch YouTube in 4K. Let me know down in the comments down below. And for me, as I start to do more on YouTube, I'm very much valuing the versatility that I'm getting from being able to get fantastic photos, but to be able to get that video as well, which the A7 III does very well. But for me, I'm starting to get to that point where I'd like to try and up my production value that little bit more. So I really hope you've enjoyed this video. If you did, please let me know down in the comments down below, and I'll catch you at the next one.